the inside. Thanks so much, David.
Thanks for having me.
The Treasurer is Josh Frydenberg, and today there were some incredible numbers that showed the Australian economy continues to grow. Now, remember, for a recession, there has to be 3 months in a row, which is a quarter, and 2 quarters consecutively, so 6 months in a row, of the economy shrinking. Now, despite how low we sank, we have come back and we are now into 9 months of economic growth. This is better than many, if not most, countries around the world, and it is certainly way better than many countries that you would dream of travelling when eventually you'll be able to get on a plane. I talked to Josh Frydenberg about that and financial support from Victoria when we spoke earlier tonight.
The numbers today show that the momentum in the Australian economy's recovery continues. We have now seen our economy become bigger than it was going into the pandemic. That's ahead of any major advanced economy around the world. And in this March quarter, we saw Japan, we saw the United Kingdom, we saw Germany, we saw France all contract as economies, whereas the Australian economy expanded. And over the last 3 quarters, we've seen GDP increase by the most we've seen in more than half a century, more than 50 years.
Now, thankfully, we've been able to essentially little road bumps like 3-day shutdowns in Brisbane or a 5-day shutdown in Perth. They don't end up showing up in the national picture as being anything that's really pulling us backwards. But your home city, your home state, in a world of pain. There's a lot of things I've had to say, and I stand by all of them about whom is responsible there. But how long can Melbourne be shut down before we start to notice it at the national level economically?
Well, today we saw more devastating news for Victorians with the extension of the lockdown. Importantly, there are some easing of restrictions for regional areas and some kids are allowed back to school. But, you know, it's been very tough for Victorian families and businesses. If you take out the initial lockdown last year, Paul, which saw the whole country effectively go into hibernation for a period, since that time, Victorians have been subject to 140 days of lockdown, whereas the average across all the other states and territories has just been 6 days. So Victoria has endured so much more than the other states, and it's very devastating.
I mean, obviously, you don't want to create a system where you reward state governments for not being proportional about the number of cases that they have. Conversely, we all know what the economic consequences are if 5 days turns into 15, turns into 25. Do we have to wait for this to go for a month before we trigger a series of things? I mean, I'm not a full-blown job keeper, but I know you're in constant conversation with these guys, but they seem to be making it clear that they're going to not wrap this thing up anytime soon.
Well, you're right about proportionality, and that's why we want our health experts to speak to their experts to better understand why they took this decision in the way that they did. We were pretty firm for the first week of the lockdown that those lockdowns can be managed by the capacity of state governments. Because it's not the first lockdown that we've seen since the end of JobKeeper. We saw one in the Greater Brisbane area, we saw one in the Perth Metropolitan and the Peel region area, and so we have seen other lockdowns where Commonwealth assistance hasn't been required. This has now been extended for a second week. That's why I talked and listened to the State Treasurer from Victoria tonight. The Prime Minister is going to be speaking to the acting Premier in Victoria. We'll hear them out and then obviously consider their request.
Do you think that in those state of emergency powers, it should be also that the state says that if there is a lockdown of X number of days, the state outlines the compensation that it is going to pay for its decisions, which might make them a little more reticent about an unnecessary broad statewide lockdown like the one that we just saw, because otherwise it feels like until it's 100% vaccination and COVID's nowhere, which will never happen, we're going to be in this every time there's an overreaction to the smallest little outbreak.
Well, I think it's an important point that the states must consider the implications of their restrictions and their lockdowns. I mean, we are now in a post-JobKeeper world, and as you know, for that year, it was the Commonwealth who was largely picking up the tab, and that helped so many communities through that very difficult period, and it's also helped see the strong recovery that we have seen just today in today's numbers. But there comes a point where there is a transition in the type of economic support that can be provided. And we anticipated in this budget that there would continue to be outbreaks, and indeed that there would even be short lockdowns, but that they could be managed.
Good on you, Treasurer. Nice to talk again. Congrats on the numbers today, and thank goodness it's you guys in charge. Otherwise, we would have bought an airline. Thanks, mate.
We would have certainly done that. Bye-bye.
He's a good man. Speaking of, Wacker Williams is our man in regional New South Wales. Love talking to him there in Inverell, because I want to talk about this meat situation where a cyber attack has knocked out huge amount of meat processing in Australia and the United States. And put simply, if we, by this point in time, it's 3 days, tens of thousands of head of cattle and sheep have not been put through the abattoirs. When does meat start to go up? What are the consequences for farmers? Also, we've just heard from Daniel Andrews. I'll tell you what he has to say straight after the break. One second.